then, because Egypt is not obviously the name that they were calling themselves. And his name was Maui. And he traveled basically into the Indian Ocean and into the Pacific Ocean to find new lands for his king. And his name is renowned through all of Polynesia because he is known as Maui, who is this
never heard of the place or guy,
right,
hey?
who is an admiral of the sea that unified all of these islands. And so here is this direct connection with Egypt traveling across the oceans. Okay. So Egypt is an interesting one. And so, I mean, chematology is as well. And so there's some aspects of chematology I agree with, and there's some that I don't, which is fine. I mean, we can all have our different opinions. It comes out of the teachings of Abdel Hakim Aywan and has gone on into his family. His son Yusuf is a stone worker and a stonemason, and I've been on tour twice in Egypt with him. And his wife, Patricia, is more into the esoteric knowledge of ancient Kem or Kemet, which is what the ancient Egyptians called their land, Kemt, basically for short. And it meant the land of the black soil or the black land. And when the Greeks arrived, they came to Memphis. Memphis is now a suburb of Cairo, one of the largest cities I've ever been in my life. There's like 60 million people in Cairo. It's huge. It's insane. I've been to New York City. I've been to Lima, Peru is pretty large as well. But Cairo blew my mind with how many people live there. And so going on tours, you start to realize that what you're hearing from the tour guides and the Egyptologists that you hire to bring on these tours doesn't match up with what you're seeing. And so this is kind of where chematology came about, because it's more of an oral spoken, not language, but history of ancient Egypt, rather than what the Egyptologists and the Greeks, kind of cobbled together through the stories that they were being told. So in Memphis, they came across a pillar. On the pillar, it said Hep-ka-Ptah in the hieroglyphs. And Ptah is like one of the founding, gods of ancient Egypt, or netters, aspect of nature, basically. And so Hep-ka-Ptah means the place where Ptah manifests. And so they thought this was the land. This is what they were calling the land. And so Hep-ka-Ptah became Hep-Keptos, which became Egyptos, which became Egypt. And so this directly comes out of a Greek naming convention, but from a misinterpretation of what was being told to them. And so a lot of what has happened in ancient, Egypt comes out of what the Greeks thought that they understood of Egypt. And so there's some interesting aspects around the timelines. When were things built? There are vases that you find in the Nubian Museum in Aswan that are dated to between 12 and 15,000 years ago. Okay. This predates any pre-dynastic and historical records of Egypt.
Never hear of that. You hear of, there's conspiracy theories that the pyramids are pre-cataclysm and older than 12,000.
Well, this is the question of the pyramids. And so you can kind of look at this. They're not so much pottery, but they're vases made out of alabaster or granite or even corundum. And corundum is a really interesting material because corundum is literally as hard as diamond. So how are you cutting this? And it's a perfect vase, right? Perfectly hollowed out on the inside. They were using tubular drills to haul out the insides. And so they had the technology to do this, but we're told through history and through, the historical references that they didn't have the technological sophistication to even build the pyramids when we were being told that they were built, which is a big head scratcher because, half of the stuff we see there is, they were using these bashing, balls of diorite and they were, pounding all this stuff out, which would take forever and a day. And the second you step foot on the
Aswan, still be doing it. It'd only be half finished.
You literally would still be doing it. The second you step onto the Aswan quarry, you see how ridiculous this is. Because the unfinished obelisk that sits there in situ, because there was a crack that they found in it and they left it. I mean, this obelisk is huge. Where they were cutting down the sides of it, and they were also cutting test pits. Okay, the test pits are probably 20, 30, 40 feet deep, if not deeper. And they would lob out, a meter by a meter hole out of the ground so that they could see where the strength of the granite that they were drilling into or that they were cutting was, so that they could find veins of it that were large enough that were unbroken or shattered.
Right, like how
are you
you
bashing this
that,
out 50
right?
feet down? You
Right?
got somebody
Like,
upside down and you're hanging onto their feet
like
or a rope and they're bashing. And how are
40
they
feet down, like
how are they removing the rubble? And
it's
so
impossible. And
it's literally impossible. And so then you go in, you look at the side elements of the obelisk, and they're about a foot wide, but there are these scoop marks that go all the way down and they curve like there was a big, routing machine that would go down and scoop out all these different areas. And little known to most people that go to Aswan Quarry, because the tour guides won't take you to these areas. On the back side of the quarry is another unfinished obelisk, and you can actually go up and get underneath it. And the scoop marks come down and wrap under the underside. So you
I've
bash it
seen
upside
pictures
down.
of that. Yeah, I've seen pictures of it. It's like it's so impossible. Like it just like no.
No. And then you go in and you watch the movie in the museum that tells you how they did this. And of course, Zahi Hawass is there. And they were slaves and they were bashing this out. And then they would bash underneath so that they could cut it out. As you're bashing underneath this thing that's going to fall on you. Right.
Can you demonstrate how to bash underneath? Like,
not
just
worry,
like to see a demonstration in the spot of how they were doing it, right? Like, just give me a little demo.
Oh,
right?
It's such a ridiculous animation. And then he sits there and says, but not to worry. Even though they were slaves, they were given beer and fed well. Oh, that's so great. You want a bunch of drunken slaves lobbing around 100-ton, 1,000-ton.
Right, yeah, right. Giant
good
weapons.
And so then the next question is how would they get these obelisks out of the quarry? Because the quarry is sunken down into an area. How are they lifting them out of that sunken area and then down to the docks to put on the boats to move up the Nile to Cairo or some of the other cities on the Nile? And when they dredged the Nile to build the Aswan Dam, it's interesting because there are none of these boulders, none of these cut stones, none of these large, 100 to 1,000-ton pieces of granite and rose quartz granite that comes out of Aswan have ever been found at the bottom of the river.
Right, so they didn't lose a single one. It was like, there wasn't a single construction accident in the entire time of this time with no technology where you
I'm talking around the port of Aswan. Yeah, it's mind blowing. And so you have to start asking yourself the question: how old are these sites really? And what we're prescribing to the dynastic and pre-dynastic Egyptians who did not have the technology to do this, who does? And so this is where chematology starts to step in and give a bit of an alternative history and a bit of an alternative story to what Egypt or Kemet was really about. And it's fascinating because if you go around with Yusuf, he'll show you like all the statues that are perfectly made, and he'll show you where the saw blade slipped for cutting, and you would have to be cutting at revolutions incredibly fast to do this. And without mechanized tools and the wheel, it's an impossibility. Yeah, you could weaponize. You can mechanize the tools using water. So all these sites are around water. You could use the water to create a spin, which would cut. But again,
you'd have to use the pressure, something to power the pressure of the water. Right?
And you'd need diamond. Well, diamond doesn't exist in this part of Africa. There is no diamond in Egypt. So where's the diamond coming from? Okay. And how would they know how to use that to cut it? And so it's fascinating that you also find, for instance, in the Osiris shaft, which they started finally opening up to tourists here. I think it was 2017, because when I was there in 2016, it wasn't open. So I think in 2017 was the first time they started opening it to tourists. And you go down from the Giza Plateau 4 layers into the bedrock, solid bedrock. And in the bottom, it's all flooded up to about your chest level. And there's 2 tunnels that go off to the side. And there's a room it's not very large. And there's this green, citrine or something. I can't remember the name of the stone, but it comes from Lebanon. And it's a solid piece box, basically, that had a lid on it. And there's a video of Zahi Hawass and somebody from ABC or CBS News down there when they pumped out all the water because they basically were trying to figure out what was in the box. Now, what's fascinating about this box is it doesn't fit down the shaft coming from the plateau, and it doesn't fit in the passageways going down either side. So how did it get down there?
And it's solid, right? I've seen them. They're like giant.
It's huge. Yeah, it's
12,
huge.
16 feet or something, and like
Those are like
tall.
that's like the Serapeum. And so another amazing site is the Serapeum, and you go down again into the bedrock underneath the earth. And there are 24. They found more, but they don't open the other doors to these other chambers. But there are 24 that they show of these perfectly aligned north, south, east, west alcoves down 3 different hallways. Okay, and they're on each side of the hallways, kind of like a tool or an instrument or a machine in a sense. And sunken down, I want to say 6 feet, 2 meters down from the actual tunnel hallway into these alcoves are these massive black andesite boxes. Okay, and they call it the Serapeum because the Seraph Bowl. They found the skeletal remains of the Seraph Bowl in one of these, and they went, oh, they must be tombs for bowls. But I don't think that's what they were used for, because of the ones that they've opened, they're all empty. And they're perfect. They're these perfect boxes. They have 90
literally perfect, like
literally
90 degree, 90 degree, 90 degree. I think it's Christopher Dunn who goes into like next level analysis.
He brought all of his measurement equipment into it. We had a guy that had a straight laser, and so he put the laser on the inside wall of the one that you can climb into, and it just beams straight across the wall. And 90-degree cut. How do you cut the inside of an angle 90 degrees? I mean, it's pretty impressive. And then
in black andesite that doesn't even fit through the hallways of these caves or into the rooms, right? Like it's
what about markings, as far as like carving markings? And
there are no carvings on any of them except one, and this is the one that you're allowed to go get inside of. And the carvings do not match the artistry of whoever built the box. It's like you have this beautiful, perfect box, and then this rough chicken scratch that was scraped into it that tells a story of Osiris and some great deed that he did. And that's it. And so it's very obvious that somebody's... Sorry, what?
Sorry. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt. Just asking, but that 90... So other than that 90-degree angle that you were talking about, that didn't have any distinct like markings, like tool markings?
You don't see any... except in the corners, because there's a corner radius, but it's so minute you wouldn't even notice it. And so that means that there basically was something that drilled into it perfectly, floor, ceiling, walls, the whole 9 yards. And it's all one solid piece of stone. So they would cut the top of the box off of the bottom and then put that on top. There are no soot marks anywhere in the hallways. So they weren't burning torches when they were building this. All of these boxes were cut in situ. So they were cut in there after being placed. Okay. And the other question is, how do they drill these tunnels? Because if you've ever been around miners usually die very young because of miner's lung. They're inhaling all this particulate mass that's finite, granular stone, and it rips their lungs and esophagus to shreds. And so how are they removing that much material out of the bedrock without the use of torches and without the use of any sort of suction device to suck all of that particulate matter out? It really is mind-boggling. And so there is a thought that perhaps this site was used as a seed vault in ancient times. This would have been around the time of the cataclysm. We don't really know. You can't carbon date stone. And so this gets into some of the other amazing, there are beautiful statues that you find all over the place that King Ramses II has put his name all over, but it's very obvious that he wasn't the one that had the statues commissioned, and his name has been graffitied on top of things that it shouldn't be there. It's like there's one placard that's graffitied
it's like
over.
A lesser chipped in, like not done nearly as professional and quality as the rest of the work, right?
Correct. And you see this all over the Cairo Museum as well. Some of these amazing statues. And so how does this tie into the chematology? Well, there's a few beliefs behind chematology that I'll rattle out. They like to use fives, the number 5 and the number 42 a lot in their methodology. And so there were 5 phases of the sun. The first phase of the sun would be called Kepher, which is the dung beetle rolling the dung onto the top of the mound in the morning, which represented the sun on the horizon coming above the horizon. Then you have what everybody thinks the Egyptian sun is, Ra. And this is adolescence or teenage years of the sun. It's around 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning. It's when the sun has some of the most intense light. And so this is called Ra. Then you have Un. Un is 2, 3 in the afternoon. Basically, it's a little calmer. You're a little bit older in your life. And so the phases of the sun also represent the phases of your life, or the Yuga cycles, or the phases of humanity or history, Iron Age, the Golden Age, this kind of thing. And then you have Aten, and Aten is where Akhenaten got his name from. He was that wasn't his original title, or his original name, but that was the name that he associated himself with, because Aten means the enlightened one. It's when the sun is the most mature. It's about to go into sunset, and then in sunset you have Amun or Amen, depending on how you pronounce it, which becomes the hidden sun or the sun in darkness. And it's interesting that in the Christian faith, at the end of your prayer you say Amen, hoping that your prayer is heard, but in reality that word means you're burying it in darkness so it will never be heard. And I've always thought that was kind of an interesting idea around the word Amun. And so this is where I was saying earlier, the headdress of Amun deals with that duality. And so you will see Ptah wearing the headdress of Amun. You will see Osiris wearing the headdress of Amun. You find this glyph all over the different temple structures in dynastic Egyptian times, telling the stories of Amun, or when these characters go into darkness or death. But in the Cometian philosophy, there was no death. It was called westing. You would follow the sun into the west, only to be reborn again as something else, basically, or someone else for that matter. And so the other 5, issue of 5, comes around the Purs. And a Pur was a house. And so I've said this before on the cast, but I'll say it again, just to boggle everybody's mind. We're always told in history that in the time of Pharaoh, there was King Tut and King Ramses and King Akhenaten, and oftentimes they're called pharaohs. But the first Pur, the first house, is called the Pur-Ah, and this is the high house. And in ancient Kemet, everything was a matriarchy. Okay, we're not talking the complete opposite of a patriarchy. It was like a unity ticket. The women would look after the land and the people, or mostly the land and the fertility of the land, and the king, her consort, would look after the people. And that was how things happened back then. We know this because you can find a multitude of statues and sculptures depicting this, where the woman will have her arm around the man as if to say, this is my property, not the other way around. Hey, babe, And so I found that incredibly a fascinating element. And so I was on a podcast with Grandmaster of the Knights Templar, Timothy Hogan, and I asked him about Pur-Ah and the high house of the woman. And this is where the word pharaoh comes from, is Pur-Ah. So the pharaoh was the high house, or the Pur-Ah. And I said, were there any male pharaohs? And he said, no, they were all kings, because they had to be initiated by the high house of Isis. So the priestesses of Isis would initiate the kings to rule the land. And so they were the pharaohs. The kings were just, the rulers of the land. And so there were no male pharaohs, period. Done deal. End of conversation.
You never ever hear of this.
You will never hear this, because the Greeks came in the Greeks came in and they saw a patrilineal existence, because that's what they were used to. That's what they came from in Greece. They didn't see a matrilineal existence where, authority was passed down from mother to daughter, similarly. But then again, it was a unity ticket. And so it was hard to decipher whether or not there were kings that were just solid kings, or if there was this unity between the king and his consort, or the queen, or the pharaoh and her consort, the king. Okay, so the second house is called Per-Neter, and the Neters were known as the gods or goddesses, but it also means an aspect of the divine, or an aspect of nature. And so Neters were natures. And you see similar philosophy in the Hindu gods and goddesses, because they are all aspects of nature as well. And you see very similar tie-overs as well into Aztec and Mayan gods and goddesses, because they were also aspects of nature to some degree. And a lot of them had very similar interchangeable names, so on and so forth. So Perneter is the house of nature, and the house of nature is a pyramid. This is what they called the pyramid. And for the Greeks, pyramid, pyramidios basically means fire in the chamber or fire in the middle, in a sense. And so this was the pyramid. It wasn't a tomb. Certainly wasn't a tomb for pharaohs, because they've never found a single pharaoh in any of the pyramids, except ones that were put in much later after they were built. Like the Unas pyramid, where the pyramid texts are, and I think there's one other one. But there were no official royal or king burials in any of the major pyramids.
That's why there's the Valley of the Kings with all of their
correct
burials.
And Valley of the Queens as well. Okay. Yeah. So then you have per Ka. Well, Ka is your physical body, your physical presentation. And so per Ka is your temple or your tomb, sorry. Because your Ka is the body. It's one of your 7 souls that's left behind when you're going into the Duat, into the nether worlds, in the Cometian and Egyptian Book of the Dead, basically. So that's your tomb, not the pyramid. Then you have per Ba. Well, Ba is your spirit or your energy, and it's often depicted with a bird with your head on it. And I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Princess Mononoke. What is it? Spirited Away. There's a character in the movie, the old mother or witch of the house, who turns into a Ba. She physically turns herself into a bird with her head on it and flies around and becomes this spirit creature that watches over what's going on, during the nighttime in this spirited away land. I've thought that concept was also very fascinating. And then the last one is Per Wir. And so Per Wir is the house of the wise. And so this is where the word wizard or wise one comes from, is this word Wir. But Wir is also similar to Osir, which is where Osiris comes from, or Bu Wizard, which is the land of Osiris. And these were more of the ancient Cometian names for these neters, basically. The Greek called him Osiris. The ancient Suf or Chem language calls him Buizer. It's the same name, but it's phonetically pronounced a little different. There's obviously, transliteration going on between Greek and the Suf, Cometian language. And so these are the 5 houses. Now, it's interesting that we found a symbol when I was there in 2016 in Tanis that actually is a 6th house. And this is fascinating, because on one of the walls, it's like 2 brackets with 3 houses inside of it, or what they call houses. It's like a square box is their pers, basically. And underneath it are 4 wavy lines. And so this would be known as Peru, the place of many houses. And I think this is super fascinating, because underneath it literally says, from the land of Tawin, which is ancient Chem, you will reach Peru, or the land of many houses, by crossing 4 waters. Well, what are the 4 waters? You got the Nile, the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, and the Amazon. And you travel up the Amazon, and where do you end up? You end up in Peru. And so there's this interesting connection, legit or not, but right there on the wall, it shows it. And there's another interesting ancient connection to South America.
How can that not be legit, though, right?
Well,
like there's just
exactly
no such thing as coincidence, right?
There is no such thing as coincidence.
And then the symbology that we're finding throughout these ancient cultures, where they're mimicking each other, especially with the double helix and the holding the snake symbology, right? And I was just talking about this, the mandala, the outer shape of that tree of life structure with the right, and that is a mimicking now that I'm finding. And yeah, it's fascinating. Thank you.
Well, this also gets into how many different cultures around the world have this weird reference to Sirius. I mean, this was a huge part of my Dropa studies, was realizing how many different cultures talk about Sirius, and one of them being this Dogon tribe in Mali, Africa. Well, the Dogons were some of the ancient oldest. Yeah, they were part of ancient.
They literally date back 10,000, 12,000 years at least in their both their oral traditions, but their like star knowledge and their megaliths. That's like their ancient star calendar still out in the deserts and stuff. It's nuts.
Which is kind of sad, because the Nubian one that they found in the middle of the Egyptian desert, it's you'd have to spend hours to get out to it. They moved it to the Nubian Museum in Aswan, and so it no longer has any of its alignments. It's really sad that they did that. They should have left. It was at a place called Napa Iglesia. That's in Peru. God, I can't think of the name of it. Anyway, regardless, they moved it, and so it no longer has that sacred astrological alignment to it. So getting back into into the storyline here, and so the biggest question is, who was this culture? How old were they? What was their lineage? Because if we have pottery dating back 15,000 years, and we have superstructures that didn't evolve around any of the technology that is allotted to the ancient or dynastic and pre-dynastic Egyptians, who's building this stuff and when? And this was a similar question that I had when I went to Peru. I went with my BS meter in the red, and I had 100 questions. And once I got to Peru and got into the field and actually saw these sites firsthand, man, my BS meter was shattered, and I had thousands of questions. And so I had the same approach when I went to Egypt, because Egypt is very similar to Peru on many megalithic aspects, but it's much larger. I mean, there's much more going on there, and they keep finding more, and they keep digging up more. And so if the Nile was continually inhabited during these periods, and they're launching these temples that they're digging up out of the mud to specific time periods within the pre-dynastic or dynastic, time periods, how are they digging these things up? If this land was continually occupied and was continually inhabited, and these temples existed during this time, why are they buried? What is that all about? So it really beggars the question, how old are a lot of these sites?
Right.
Yeah, and like how many of them, sorry, Brittany, and how many of them have been reconstructed to some extent or repurposed and essentially hidden for that reason too, right?
Well, the whole Aswan Dam situation right there. It's like they were covering stuff up. They were flooding a huge area that now you can't dig down and get into, because all of that underground stuff is now covered full of water. And
that's a recurring theme, that drowning towns with dams thing.
Yeah, you're referring to Abu Simbel. So Abu Simbel sits underneath the water now, and they basically moved up all of these statues that are giant that were sitting in the front of Abu Simbel up to the surface and rebuilt it up on top. And then they built this little tiny alcove that you could walk into. But underneath and under the water of the dam is a cave system, or a cut tunnel system that goes way back, and we have no idea what's up there. And so when the German engineers came in and rebuilt, the Temple of Isis, everyone's like, oh, this is the magical temple, and there's the Holy of Holies in the back of it. And you got to remember that that's not the original site of where that temple was. And when it was being rebuilt, they didn't align specific pieces of artwork together properly. And so there you can see this misalignment just about everywhere. And it's interesting because in the back of the Temple of Isis, on one of the walls, is this character of, Quetzalcoatl, where they found it in Levanta. I'm trying to remember exactly which stela it is, but it's a depiction of this guy sitting inside of like a snake or a dragon. And this exact same symbology is found, it's almost identical, is found at the Isis temple in Aswan on the island of Philae. Now, what's even more fascinating about that is on Elephantine Island, which is an interesting spot, on one of the back walls is a depiction of a South American wearing one of those feathered or ferned headdresses and not wearing the garb of a traditional Egyptian or Comitian. And so who is this guy? And right next to him is the picture of a foot over three wavy lines. And this was called Asgat. Asgat was water, the ancient word for water. Nafir, which means the harmony of water. Well, the other name for water in the ancient Suf Commission tongue was Maya. And so Maya is the name for water. And so here you have a depiction of a Mayan or somebody from South America in Egypt. And we know that the South Americans came to Egypt because they found cocaine with the mummies.
No doubt.
But wasn't he supposedly blonde hair, blue eyed?
Who?
Isn't that the depiction, Kozakot, or I can never say his name, so I'm going to apologize.
Yeah, he had a beard too, which most native South Americans they can't grow facial hair. Like,
so what if the possibility is that he came, or that he came into South America and then maybe there was a migration to Egypt? And I only say that because of the possible connection with ancient Egypt and the Kincaid caves and the Illinois.
Well, even the time period of the dreaded A word Atlantis, right? The time, it wasn't a place; it was a time period, very similar to what we're living today. The world was connected,
just a globalized world.
We had a globalized world in the time of Attilan or Atlantis, and so when Atlantis flooded, or we got into the Holocene, comet impact event, which caused meltwater pulse 1b. And basically, in a matter of days, we had 500 feet sea level rise, and
which would wipe out 90%, 97% of the Earth's population today, right?
Bingo, and did back then. And we were basically left back in the Stone Age in a sense. And so there were these admirals of the sea, these nautical people that ended up in different countries, teaching people how to farm, how to do animal husbandry, a little bit about their own history. And we know this because all these cultures have these legends of these people. And so Quetzalcoatl was one, Kukulkan was another, the guy from Peru also, his name is spacing me at the moment, but another element of the same person, the Noah or the Kushnakindi, and all these people had a very similar aspect of helping to reteach the population that was left on the planet how to survive, because a lot of the knowledge was lost very quickly. Where I live here in the Pacific Northwest, I mean, you go up into the gorge, it's gorgeous here, the Columbia Gorge, and you realize, my God, there's 2 miles of ice sitting above me that moved through this valley in a matter of minutes and ripped all that out. Not millions of years, minutes. And
it's one of the most ridiculously beautiful places in the world. I could pull up a picture right now, but I'm actually in the same area. I'm in Oregon.
Oh, wow. Right on. Yeah. Okay. Excellent. Another one. Excellent. But to me, I mean, this is incredibly fascinating. And so who is this character Maya? And there's even a temple of Maya. It's outside of Saqqara, which is just south of Giza. And you go into this temple and you see this depiction of this guy on the wall, and some of the depictions, he's dressed like a commissioner or an ancient Egyptian. But in one or two of them, he's wearing this plumed, hat, basically, and not looking like a commission. Well, this could be anybody, but if you get the right guy, the guy with the keys, right? If you get the right guy and you give him enough bucksheesh, he takes you into the back room, which there's nothing special in it. But then he'll point to the ceiling and turn on his torch, and the entire ceiling is all this ancient Mayan glyph work, basically, very similar to what you find in Peru. And it's been photographed, and it's actually been confirmed, but it hasn't been translated because it's a lost language, a lost written or scripted language. But it has been confirmed by Mayan.
The conquistadors intentionally genocided and wiped out when they conquered that region.
But there's still some in Utah. There's still some hieroglyphics with Phoenician symbolism in Utah.
Interesting. We were talking about the Magna Fuente bowl on a recent
last one. The Magna Fuente bowl down in Bolivia, right?
Yeah.
And it's literally the what's the name? The rune star,
it's
I always forget the Egyptian one, right?
It's cuneiform, not hieroglyphic.
Yeah. No, but where the Roman, it has the Roman, the Egyptian,
the Rosetta Stone.
Rosetta Stone. It's like the Rosetta Stone of South America.
It's got hieroglyphic and Coptic. So
yeah, it's got all three, and it's like this bowl that a farmer found in his field, and was feeding his pigs out
Eating
of,
his
and
pigs
then
out of it.
it was like Eric Van Daniken, I think, that like was down in there or something.
Two different types of cuneiform writing. One is a commoner's writing, and the other one is like a hierarchy, basically an upper caste writing. And in the same area, they found a stele, which is probably 5 or 6 feet tall, that also has Phoenician hieroglyphics on it as well. And so this is fascinating as well. And then you go to Australia and you go to Gosford, and you have the Gosford glyphs, which are they've been translated and they have been dated basically through the translation, and they're legit. I mean, people are like, oh, this is somebody having a cruel joke with graffiti out in the middle of nowhere, which is strange because there's actually supposedly a pyramid near there out in the middle of
several actually
in Australia.
Yeah.
And it tells of two brothers that came on a trading adventure to Australia. When they left, the trade went great. They liked the Aboriginals that were living there. They had a good trade. But when they left, they got into a storm and it capsized their ship. And one of the brothers died. And so the glyphs are a memorial to the brother. And it's really fascinating because, again, we're told that, the Egyptians never went anywhere. And so we have the story of Maui, this admiral. And then we have these two brothers that are trading. And when you're in, I believe it's in Karnak, Karnak's so huge. You could spend 4 days there and see probably 1/5 of it. I mean, that's how big Karnak is. But you go into this one section of the room, and everything on the wall are all these different sea creatures that you would find out in the open ocean, not in the Nile or in the Red Sea or in the Mediterranean. We're talking like oceanic creatures. And so how would they have had knowledge of this, to put them in their artistic, interpretations on the walls? And so these are the bizarre histories around, ancient.
But it's not bizarre at this point. It's just there's so much evidence that stacks up. It's undeniable at this
Sometimes
point.
It's just still fascinating, no matter how many times you hear it.
There's a lot of people trying to debunk this out there as well, but most of these people have never gone into the field. They've never been to these sites. And it's like once you're at these sites and you see what you're looking at and you hear the story of what the history of this is supposed to be, and it just does not add up at all. It does not compute. Some of it does because it's obvious when these things were built, but the more ancient structures, they don't have writings on them. So all the newer stuff does. The vases and sculptures are mind-blowing. As I was saying, some of them at the Nubia Museum date back to 12 and 15,000 BC. So
shout out Walter Bosley watching. We actually mentioned you at the beginning of the stream. And Walter, if you'd like to do a show with Hans sometime, I'd love to make the three of us make a very good episode.
Yeah, I would actually. Love the work. Anyway, so it's an interesting history for sure. And as we know, most scholars are, we like to call it quackademia to some degree. Shout out to Joseph Farrell with that one. Most people in that realm, they try and lump all these histories into a very finite timeline because they're trying to keep to this bizarre biblical timeline for sure. And so it's fascinating that we keep finding stuff that keeps going back further and further and further. And so you have these impossible vases out of diorite and corundum, one of the hardest stones on the planet, dating back to 15,000 years ago. And you have sites like Göbekli Tepe and Karen Tepe now that they've discovered near Göbekli Tepe that are also 12,000 years old.
Karen Tepe, I believe, like 14 to 16,000.
Yeah, it might be even older. And then you have very similar ruins on the island of Malta. I mean, which could date back even further, especially when you have these cart ruts that go, pretty several hundred
deep
meters
into the ocean. Right?
And so during the last ice age, that all would have been out of water. There could have been a land bridge connection between Malta and the mainland based on all this water. And so it's an interesting fascination. And then when you're on the Giza Plateau itself, you look down these large cut like well shafts that go down, several layers. And if you do the research and you talk to the right people, I've been down 4 of these layers, but they go down to at least 10 or more. And these tunnel systems that are in each of these layers are the size of semi-truck, cars, like the box of the semi-truck. And they go for 18, 20, sometimes 50 kilometers out into the Western desert from Giza, past Saqqara and Dendara and that whole area. And they go down 10 levels. And so this would be more like 20 levels because you have all the bedrock in between. And so who's cutting these? Because obviously these were cut long before the pyramids were ever put there, or maybe during that time period. But who's cutting these and what were their purpose? Well, after the cataclysm, if we're to believe the story of the Holocene comet impact event, a comet broke up over Alaska and Canada, and its debris field spread all the way down into the Middle East. And so chunks of it were landing just about everywhere. And we know this through Randall Carlson's amazing work, where they're finding these diamond beadulets all over the place that are a remnant from this breakup. And one of these would have splashed down quite possibly in the Mediterranean, which would have pushed water up and over into what was then very fertile land. And it would have brought all the silt out of the Mediterranean into this area.
And all the salt, and would have killed the jungles of fertile
killed the jungles and turned it into an arid desert. Correct. Correct. And so that was known as, if you look at the old maps, you can kind of still see it. The Germans called this the Ur-Nile, the older Nile. And it was very wide, and it was on the western side of Cairo. The Nile, as we know it today, goes through the middle of Cairo, and Giza is on the western side of Cairo. And so it's really interesting. And so were they bringing water to the sites from the Ur-Nile? Because it could have been a way of draining a lot of that out and repurposing it. But we don't really know what these tunnel systems are for. Down past 4 levels, that's where the water table is now, as I was describing the Osiris shaft. So most of these underneath are all flooded with water. And when we were in the Osiris shaft, Yusuf was tasting the water, and he's like, wow, this is like some of the cleanest water I've ever had, because it's filtering through all that natural limestone and all that bedrock. And so really, really, really interesting stuff, and really old.
It could have been made for agricultural purposes potentially then as well, right?
For sure. And that's, what was the Nile? I mean, I was just at Contact in the Desert, and my friends were all laughing because they're, a couple of them are Canadian, a couple of them are British, and we're having a good joke. And like, God, it's so beautiful here, all this green grass and all these beautiful palm trees. And I looked at them and I'm like, are you kidding me? None of that exists here. It's all brought in. Well, what do you mean? I'm like, look at the hills behind Palm Springs. It looks like a nuclear waste site. There isn't any vegetation on any of the hills. And I said, you've been to Egypt. Where do the palm trees and, where's the fertility of Egypt? It's along the Nile. It's nowhere else. It's all along the Nile. I think you're on mute, Bernie.
Sorry, yeah, it would have literally rinsed the salt back out on the flood seasons from that impact, and that's why that's the only thing that grows there. And that if you look at Australia as well, it also looks like it was covered by this salt wave at some point, this giant salt tsunami that turned it into this arid, non-growing, lively place, just like the Sahara.
Well, and it's like Eastern Oregon, where they're now finding they just said there's an 18,000-year-old settlement that they found. And that's where they said that one of the oldest known petroglyphs was over in this area, Heart Mountain, where I've shown Burneye that I've actually found aerial circles.
I need to drive out
that
there.
You can see from Google Earth. That's clearly, ancient. It's not, like recent. But I did like what I was getting about Eastern Oregon is the fact that if you really look at and they talk about that there was a giant lake bed in there. If you really look at that structure, you can clearly see the flood. I mean, and that does connect to the Scablands, I feel like, because of the location.
Well, also interesting with the Scablands, as Randall has pointed out, there's this layer of black silt that was deposited in it, and it's very obvious at what point in time that came about. I don't know if you had listened to one of the other shows that we did, but right north of us, between Olympia and Vancouver, Washington, just outside of Longview there. Longview is a really interesting city. Talk about talk about planned city and what it looks like. Look up the maps of Longview, and you'll be kind of you'll be blown away by it. But just outside of that is this place called Mount Tum Tum, and it clearly looks like a pyramid. I mean, it's considered a cinder cone.
I can think of the name.
But it's terraced. The natives used it because it's along a river. They used it as a landmark for trading, and so it has this history, locally, not just being a supposed cinder cone. And it was for sale a couple of years ago, which was really interesting. I would love to have bought that spot. And the sign says great for zip lining and stuff like that. I'm like, that would be so cool.
Right?
So cool.
Somebody said there's supposed to be a pyramid, and I thought I kind of found one on Google Earth that's kind of behind like Arch Rock off the coast, like in the Coast Range.
Interesting.
It's tucked back in that. Maybe it's kind of closer to the Neocani Mountain, but I know it's not, specifically that mountain. It's like tucked back further. Wow, but and I've looked up there is some logging road access to get in there, so I was going to get a bike and a permit.
I'm sending the two of you on that expedition.
Yeah, you can. I would go out there and check it out for sure. That would be really interesting. I mean, that's the beauty of where we live out here, is there's so much within an hour in any direction. You have the gorge, you have Mount Hood, you have the prairie and the plains. Basically, you have the Cascades, you have the coast. It's like everything's within an hour. It's very beautiful out here.
It's wonderful. I absolutely love it here.
So yeah, anyway, that's kind of my historical aspect around some of the elements of Kemet, but then also around a lot of the ancient history or unknown history of what we call today Egypt, or the land of Kem. And so
it's been Greekicized, basically.
It's been Greekicized.
Understanding, yeah. And that's a perfect hour of it. We're going to cut it short at an hour today. But Walter Bosley stated he'd be down 100% for doing a show. So I'll email him, and we will be back. We'll look forward to an episode of Hans, myself, and Walter, as well as we will have to be back with next week if you're available again, because we can't leave it at number 4. We'll have to be number 5.
Four's not a great number.
Right, we'll have Julia, Sarah, myself, Hans, maybe Zertis, and keep this series going. And
excellent. I appreciate the platform and the time, and I love sharing the knowledge that I've collected over the years. So thanks again. And thanks to all the awesome people in the crowd. Yeah, I enjoyed this.
Thank you.
It was amazing. It was awesome. And Walter gives the thumbs up. So thank you all. And thank you, Sarah, who has made several of the backgrounds and this little video that we're going to exit with.
Oh, excellent. Right.
The next one.
You crazy mother. Yeah.
It's just Burneye.